Hello, everyone. My name is TJ Billard, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Applied Transgender Studies, and it is my great honor to welcome you all to the third event in the Center's Distinguished Lecture Series for 2022. Events in this series will feature fellows from the center discussing their own original research with a broad range of scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and interested laypersons. And all of these events will, just like this one, be virtual, free to attend, and open to the public. Just note that this will be our last event before the summer holidays. So our break will last through June and July, and we will return with our next event in August. So without further ado, let's get to today's speaker. Aniruddha Dutta is a senior fellow in the center and an associate professor of gender, women's and sexuality studies at the University of Iowa. Dr. Dutta's research interests include transnational sexualities, globalization, development, political economy, and the institutionalization of gender and sexual politics in India. Their work has appeared in journals such as Transgender Studies Quarterly, QED, a journal in GLBTQ worldmaking, and Gender in History. And they have an article forthcoming on the same topic as their talk today in the inaugural issue of the Bulletin of Applied Transgender Studies coming out next month. Dr. Dutta also works as a volunteer and advisor with several collectives of gender non-conforming communities, such as kothis and hijras in Eastern India. Today, they will be delivering their talk, Suturing and Disrupting the State, Indian Trans Activism in the Aftermath of COVID-19. Dr. Dutta will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, at the end of which we will have 15 to 20 minutes of moderated Q&A. So during the talk, feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions, and I will be sure to ask them in our discussion portion. So with that, Dr. Dutta, the room is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Billard, and thank you everyone at CATS for facilitating this opportunity for me to come and discuss and share my research. And I would also like to, at the beginning, thank all the activists and community members and my sisters who enabled this work to happen and so generously shared their lives and insights with me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see the presentation. Please let me know if you have any trouble in accessing it. Okay, so is this visible to everyone? Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes, and thank you. And so the full title of my talk today is Suturing and Disrupting the State, Indian Trans Activism in the Aftermath of COVID-19. And I start with two quotes from two trans/hijra activists. I'll explain some of these terms as I go along. And I've actually retained the real names for a lot of these people as a way to kind of acknowledge and document their contributions during the pandemic, but also beyond. So the first is by Moshumi Shaha, a guru or leader of the trans feminine Hijra community at Kollani, West Bengal, India. And she says, this is actually during an interview that she gave me in 2021. So we became destitute. Why? The Jonagon or general public had no income. Buses, trains were not running. People were not in a situation to be able to work. And she's referring here to the first intensive lockdown instituted in March 2020. Then the second one is from Silk, a trans activist from the same region. And she says, quote, "The government evaded its responsibility. It provided relief to our community mainly to earn a good name for itself. If 1,000 of us needed relief, it provided only to 300. Also, it did not give relief immediately, but only when we had started raising our voices, when they heard that relief was coming in from abroad, that we were doing fundraising," unquote. As elsewhere in the world, transgender and gender non-conforming persons, particularly communities from predominantly working class and Dalit or oppressed caste backgrounds, such as hijras and kothis, have been among those hit hardest during the COVID-19 pandemic in India. Journalists and scholars have documented a litany of impacts, including loss of livelihood, psychosocial isolation, lack of access to healthcare and relief, and intensified social stigma due to fears of COVID-19 transmission or contamination from these communities. As Silk's aforementioned statement suggests, these impacts were not merely due to the pandemic itself, but also partly due to the state's response to it. This response was spectacularly exemplified by the first phase of the lockdown declared by the central government on March 24th, 2020, with just a few hours of notice, which was meant to contain the transmission of COVID-19, but ironically may have fostered its spread from urban to rural areas due to the exodus of migrant workers who lost their employment in cities. The early phases of India's lockdown, dubbed the harshest and most extensive in the world, imposed an almost complete ban on commercial, religious, and cultural activity, except for some essential services, and exerted severe restrictions on people's movement, which particularly affected the working poor. While measures related to physical distancing are obviously essential to containing the pandemic, Indian public health activist networks, such as the Jan Swasth Abhiyan, have critiqued the centralized and top-down imposition of the lockdown, which involved police violence and treated unprivileged people like, quote, criminals or subjects under colonial rule, unquote. In that context, many leftist, feminist, and trans scholars and activists in India have taken a skeptical stance toward COVID-related containment measures, in contrast to much left liberal opinion in the West. Leftist economist Jayati Ghosh, for example, argues that, quote, the nature of the government response destroyed the economy and forced millions into poverty and hunger, but did not contain virus transmission, unquote. Further, as suggested by Silk's statement that we just heard a little while back, the first lockdown's severity and ultimate inefficacy contrasted with the inadequacy of relief packages announced by the central and state governments, many of which merely repackaged provisions that had been announced in the budget before the pandemic. In this context, this talk will examine the role of transgender activists in communities in addressing the pandemic and related measures such as lockdowns based on ethnographic fieldwork conducted in Eastern India and particularly focusing on the first wave of COVID-19 in 2020. As Silk indicates, the debilitating effects of the lockdown and inadequate or tokenistic relief prompted a flurry of organizing and fundraising by trans and kothi-hijra, that is trans-feminine spectrum, activists and organizations. Scholars have documented how this burgeoning sphere of COVID-related activism addressed not just their own communities, but also other marginalized social groups, and thus helped mitigate the intensified socioeconomic marginalization of trans as well as other vulnerable people during this period. However, this process also highlights how, in Silk's words, quote, the government evaded its responsibility, unquote, which was instead transferred onto civil society and non-state entities. As Aniruddha Dutta notes based on work in Bangalore and South India, quote, in this absence of state, civil society stepped in to address the knock-on effects of subsistence rupture to the urban poor and their families, unquote. Such mobilizations may be seen as accelerating the process of responsibilization, a phenomenon wherein the civil society and individuals take up responsibility to make up for the decline of state infrastructure, welfare, and social security that characterizes neoliberal capitalism. And there's much work by scholars such as Aradhana Sharma and Burchell and others, which actually details this phenomenon. However, as I will argue, such mobilizations also evidence several ambiguities and contradictions rather than completely fitting into the narrative of neoliberal responsibilization, which tells only a part of the story. Activists not only contested neoliberal tendencies, but the Indian state also utilized this period to institute or rebuild developmental mechanisms for trans welfare, such as transgender development boards and councils. Following long-term patterns of state-led development in India, such mechanisms were constituted in non-transparent and hierarchical ways, and thus working class and or Dalit trans activists also had to contest and negotiate with the developmentalist facets of the Indian state. Sometimes, and sometimes in the process, they actually leveraged their expanded welfare rules within the process of neoliberal responsibilization to do so. In this context, I will build on existing scholarship on Indian neoliberalism to argue that the functionings of the Indian state and its evolving relation with marginalized communities during and beyond the pandemic belies any universalizing conception of neoliberalism as such, and rather suggests a patchy though impactful incorporation of certain typically neoliberal policies such as deregulation, privatization, and reduction of social safety nets, alongside continuing ideologies of the developmentalist and welfarist state. I argue that both independent trans initiatives that substitute for state welfare and the incorporation of trans activism into the state's developmental mechanisms have reinforced profound inequalities among activists and communities based on class, caste, and geographic location, as evident in unequal access to private funding, as well as in the prioritization of elite trans activists within undemocratically constituted state bodies for trans welfare. However, trans activism has also directly or subtly counteracted both neoliberal and developmentalist modes of governance, and even played them against each other where possible to maximize opportunities for survival and empowerment. But not all trans people occupy similar positions vis-a-vis the state. A relatively small section of privileged trans activists have tended to bolster and suture neoliberal and developmentalist modes of governance with each other, and thus to help consolidate state power, whereas activists in more precarious positions have utilized fractures in state government and contradictions between neoliberal and developmentalist modes of governance to disrupt the state's simultaneous regulation and neglect of their communities, even as they must compromise with the state for survival. The following sections explore these contradictory and frictional tendencies based on qualitative research, specifically ethnographic fieldwork and interviews conducted in the Eastern Indian state of West Bengal in 2020 and 2021. I particularly focus on a spectrum of feminine identified people, usually assigned male or less commonly intersex at birth, who go by various names, including transgender, kothi, and hijra. Kothi is a term used by a spectrum of gender variant people, including those who describe themselves as feminine males, as women, as a third or separate gender, as well as those who express fluid or mixed identities. Hijra communities comprise a similar range of subject positions, but are more typically associated with formalized kinship systems organized around a guru chela or leader-disciple hierarchy, and also with certain typical professions, such as blessing people for money during auspicious occasions like childbirth, or in public spaces like streets and trains, based on their cultural association with the auspicious power to bestow people with fertility. Some kothis and hijras also do sex work, which generally occupies a lower status among community professions. There's also much overlap between these communities. For example, some kothis may join hijra kinship systems and professions, either temporarily or permanently. My ethnographic engagement with these communities stretches over a period of 14 years, and as a non-binary trans feminine person, I've come to be included as a community member, although my interlocutors are cognizant of my relatively privileged position as a middle-class dominant caste and English-speaking person. For this talk, I draw on ethnography as well as collaborative activism conducted in several spurts between June 2020 and December 2021 in 3 districts of West Bengal, as well as interviews of key activists in these regions. In the first subsequent section, I built on the work of scholars such as Aradhana Sharma, Srila Roy, and Stephen Legg, who have theorized the Indian state as being simultaneously neoliberal and developmentalist, to argue that governance during the COVID-19 pandemic has functioned as an assemblage or unstable conjuncture of neoliberal and developmentalist policies and strategies. In Sharma's words, an assemblage is made up of heterogeneous elements that are not necessarily internally coherent, but are brought together for specific strategic ends, unquote. I contend that the evolution of state policies and its relation with marginalized communities during the pandemic suggests the continuing reconfiguration of neoliberal and developmentalist elements within this assemblage, rather than marking a radical crisis-induced departure from neoliberalism. The second section draws upon ethnographic observations and interviews to specifically situate trans communities and activism within this neoliberal developmentalist assemblage, and explores the resultant contradictions that have been negotiated by these groups and activists. I will conclude by suggesting some structural limitations and potentials of trans activism during the pandemic and beyond. So the first section, Situating India's COVID-19 Governance, a Neoliberal Developmentalist Assemblage. The Indian state's heavily interventionist response to COVID-19 during the pandemic, citing the collective ends or imperatives of public health, combined with inadequate welfare provision, require some contextualization of India's position vis-a-vis the larger phenomenon of neoliberalism. While there are varied articulations of neoliberalism as a concept, definitions tend to commonly stress the deregulation of capital, the privatization of public services, and the reduction of the state's role in development and social welfare programs, even as the state might take on strong and even expanded roles to secure the interests of capital. As Kiasha Naidu states, neoliberalism promotes individualism and includes the belief that unregulated free markets yield efficiency and prosperity. The state is expected to act minimally to secure the conditions necessary for the market, unquote. However, as scholars such as Aradhana Sharma and Aywa Ong have argued, relationships between the state, market, and society are articulated unevenly across the global south, and variations in the nature and extent of state interventions trouble the supposed global homogeneity of neoliberalism. Commentators on the COVID-19 pandemic have pointed out how the pandemic has exposed the paradoxes and limitations of neoliberal economic logics that prompt the state to depart from its expected role. Kiasha Naidu, for example, notes that the COVID-19 pandemic compelled governments across the world to take strong decisions in collective solidarity. Pooja Mehra writes how the pandemic caused states to ramp up welfare measures. For example, quote, the Narendra Modi government in India will foot the bill for the Employees Provident Fund or EPF contributions, although the package leaves out billions of informal workers, unquote. Some scholars like Rajitsky see such measures as portending the end of neoliberalism, while others like Miloš Šimonia argues that they are akin to a form of emergency Keynesianism rather than a long-term departure from neoliberalism as such. While theorizations of the pandemic as prompting temporary or long-term departures from neoliberalism might well be valid in certain contexts, they might also inadvertently totalize the idea of neoliberalism as the overarching current phase of capitalism from which countries are now compelled to deviate due to the pandemic-induced crisis. As scholars such as Sharma, Stephen Lex, Sheila Roy, and Pallavi Raunka have argued, a generalized concept of neoliberalism cannot capture the complex and ambiguous negotiations between developmentalism, state welfare, and select neoliberal principles in India. Roy and Legg state that even after the liberalization of the Indian economy in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Indian state has continued to be both developmentalist and neoliberalizing. Under pressures from international financial institutions like the IMF or International Monetary Fund, successive Indian governments have profoundly and yet selectively adopted certain typical neoliberal policies while deviating from other elements of neoliberal ideology. Conformity with neoliberal principles is clearly evident in cases like the deregulation of markets to enable greater foreign investment and the privatization of sectors like banking and aviation, as well as the reduction of agricultural subsidies. However, the Indian state has evidenced a more fluctuating treatment of welfare as well as socioeconomic individualism. Sharma notes that there has been a numerical increase in quasi-state and non-state actors such as NGOs, that is non-governmental organizations, in the post-liberalization period, sometimes aided by the state itself, which even sponsors some NGOs but shifts the direct responsibility and burden of poverty relief and grassroots development to non-state bodies. This translates to a gradual responsibilization of non-state actors for social services. However, as Sharma states, quote, the contemporary Indian state cannot fully relinquish its development and welfare functions because its legitimacy rests on precisely such functions. The developmentalist imperatives of the state have meant that the Indian government continues to run and has even expanded some large-scale welfare-based programs, unquote. The state's wavering stance towards welfare becomes clear with respect to India's public distribution system, or PDS, which delivers subsidized food grains to about 2/3 of the population. So during the post-liberalization period, there were several attempts to actually trim down the PDS system to a more kind of targeted distribution coverage, which would only include the poorest of the poor. But after pressure from large-scale social movements and public health movements, right to food campaigns, etc., the PDS system was actually finally not reduced, and in fact, its coverage was even expanded during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this suggests that the idea of state and politicians providing welfare has remained ideologically important preceding and during the pandemic, even as the state has also reduced public expenditure in some sectors, such as healthcare, in typical neoliberal fashion. The coexistence of developmentalist and neoliberal tendencies might work in both tense or frictional and developmentalist and neoliberal tendencies in contemporary India might work both in tense and frictional ways on one hand, and in more convergent or reconciliatory ways on the other hand. On one hand, as Pallavi Raunka notes, developmentalist tendencies may work to counteract or temper the effects of neoliberal principles by, quote, maintaining and extending welfare programs, unquote, allowing the growth of corporate capitalism while mitigating its effects with anti-poverty programs. And this harkens back to an earlier phase of developmentalist state-led capitalism that was evidenced in the 70s and 80s in India. On the other hand, developmental and welfare initiatives might also work in tandem or extend certain neoliberal policy agendas. Aradhana Sharma notes how government-sponsored rural women empowerment programs reconfigured the state's commitment to national development through its ability to empower marginalized subjects to care for themselves and to participate in the project of self-rule, thus ultimately serving the end of individualized responsibilization. Amrita Chachi notes that the current government has redesigned welfare mechanisms to draw in unprivileged populations into webs of finance capitalism by mandating beneficiaries to apply for the so-called jam trinity of bank accounts, biometric identification or Aadhaar cards, and mobile phones, which increasingly brings the rural poor into the ambit of private and public banks and credit schemes. These tendencies also suggest how developmentalist and neoliberal elements can work in tandem to extend the state's digital surveillance of vulnerable populations. However, the typically neoliberal push towards economic individualism and entrepreneurship is accompanied by a contentious relationship with individual liberties and freedoms associated with late capitalism, as is also true of right-wing forces in the global north. So scholars like Ashwini Tambe point out how exclusionary forms of Hindu collective identity and related social moralities have been encouraged during the rule of the NDA government, that is the current right-wing government, leading to the curtailment of individual and group rights for religious and gender sexual minorities. These varying tendencies suggest that the overall trajectory of Indian society and polity in the post-liberalization period does not neatly fit any overarching concept of neoliberalism, but is perhaps better understood as an assemblage or unstable conjuncture, in Sharma's words, quote, heterogeneous elements that are not necessarily internally coherent, but are brought together for specific strategic ends, unquote. These ends, ranging from corporate appeasement to electoral gain, are sometimes convergent and sometimes more frictional with each other. Now, coming to neoliberal and developmentalist elements in the COVID-19 lockdown, the Indian state's governance during COVID-19 might be seen as an evolving moment in the long-term assemblage of neoliberal, developmentalist, and welfarist policies in India. Critics of neoliberalism note that the lack of adequate state expenditure on healthcare precipitated the COVID-19 crisis across many countries, including India. Yet during the crisis itself, the government took on a strong interventionist role in enforcing lockdowns and collective behaviors for the putative social good, contra the elements of neoliberal ideology that valorize individualism and a minimized state. The public health activist network Jan Swasth Abhiyan points out that the Indian state's lockdown in 2020 generalized containment strategies that were not well suited to the Indian context and ultimately did not promote safer behaviors, and recommends that local populations should be treated as partners in controlling COVID-19 rather than as subjects of power. Drawing on Rob Kitchen, Aniruddha Dutta suggests that the state's reliance on lockdowns and digitized surveillance for disease control, while neglecting the multidimensional issues faced by the poor during this period, suggests an approach of technological solutionism to the pandemic. While some technologies of pandemic control are new, the top-down application of abstract and putatively objective professional knowledges without adequate local input or partnership is a hallmark of pre-neoliberal developmentalist policy, as has been shown by scholars such as Arturo Escobar in the Latin American context. While the lockdown was typically developmentalist in some ways, it also demonstrated some key neoliberal elements. As the Public Health Network Jan Swasth Abhiyan points out, the Indian state enforced the lockdown as its main strategy while not adequately backing it up with other expert recommendations, such as investment in healthcare, large-scale testing, or resource provision for lockdown-affected people. Thus, in effect, the government evaded or minimized its responsibility for healthcare and other social provisions, but unleashed state power to enforce individual and collective responsibility for ending the pandemic, particularly on oppressed caste and working class people who were the ones punished most brutally for violating the lockdown. This reinforces the tendency of neoliberal responsibilization, which renders subjects as individually responsible for a task which previously would have been the duty of another, usually a state agency. And this is a formulation I borrow from O'Malley, writing in 2009. Neoliberal tendencies were also evident in the developmental and welfare measures meant as pandemic relief. While the state has touted its welfarist image during the crisis by announcing a slew of relief packages, including the provision of free food grains to the poor through the PDS or public distribution system, commentators have noted that more than half of these measures were actually merely repackaged versions of support that had been already included in the pre-pandemic 2020 budget. Moreover, there were significant exclusions in the delivery of services and benefits due to the use of outdated census data in selecting PDS recipients. For several direct cash transfer schemes, the state required recipients to hold back the state required recipients to hold bank accounts and biometric identity cards, which excluded significant sections of the rural poor from these packages. This also specifically affected trans and kothi-hijra communities, since many trans people do not have updated identity documents or bank accounts. Apart from parsimonious and exclusionary welfare measures, the leftist activist Harshvardhan critiques how the state also used the pandemic period to roll back environmental regulations on businesses and to relax labor laws. The state is thus rolled back in the case of relief provision, labor law enforcement, and corporate regulation, but enhanced in the case of surveillance and regulation of especially poor people, for example, through the control of public mobility. This combines the worst of neoliberal responsibilization with top-down developmentalism and welfarist posturing. Now coming to trans activism in the neoliberal developmentalist assemblage that I just examined. So trans activism in India during COVID-19 fits within the process of responsibilization by filling in for the aforementioned lack of adequate state support, but also it has linked up with the state's developmentalist mechanisms through which sporadic welfare has been provided to these communities. Reports note that the direct cash transfer relief packages announced by the central government for the general public were inaccessible to a lot of transgender people due to their lack of required documents. While some essential food grains have been provided free of cost to eligible recipients through the public distribution system or PDS during the pandemic through a combination of central and state government allocations, Silk, the aforementioned trans activist based in Kollani, West Bengal, told me that many trans and kothi-hijra people in her area did not have ration cards which are required to access the PDS system, or had left them at home under male names prior to migrating to undertake hijra professions. In this scenario, some transgender activists have advocated for specifically targeted schemes for trans people through several appeals to central and state governments, including 2 letters or petitions signed by over 2,000 trans activists and community members that were submitted to the central government early in the pandemic in March and April 2020. These efforts may be seen as pushing the state to uphold its welfare roles and thus as contesting neoliberal tendencies. The state response to such advocacy has been two-sided, involving measures announced by both the central government and various state governments. The central government's National Institute for Social Defense, or NISD, which is housed under its Ministry for Social Justice and Empowerment, announced a cash transfer package of 1,500 rupees or less than $50 per head for transgender applicants, which was first disbursed in April 2020 during the first wave of COVID-19 and then repeated in June, July 2021 during the second wave. Individual state governments also announced some relief measures. For example, the West Bengal government provided relief packages thrice over the 2 years of 2020 and 2021, comprising the distribution of essential food items to trans people in the state. These packages thus provided sporadic relief and not regular monthly support. There were also many layers of exclusion and hierarchization in the ways that these welfare schemes were designed and implemented. Only about 4,500 people, or less than 1% of the documented trans population in the 2011 census, received the minuscule NISD grant of rupees 1,500 in April 2020, even though a government official claimed in May that 6,000 beneficiaries had been reached. So again, there's a kind of discrepancy between the state's sort of projection of its welfarist image and the actual retrenchment of welfare. By the end of the year, the number had expanded to only about 7,000 for the entire country. Further, applicants were required to fill out online Google forms in English or Hindi. This reinforced long-standing linguistic hierarchies that have historically favored languages associated with transnational capital, that is English, and North Indian nationalism, that is Hindi, despite the inaccessibility of these languages to a large number of Indians and the equal recognition of so-called regional languages in the Indian constitution. Such linguistic hierarchization meant that those who were not well-versed in these languages or who lacked internet access had to rely on more formally educated and internet-enabled activist intermediaries to fill out these forms, thus reinforcing class and caste hierarchies, given that such access is more typically available to middle class and dominant caste community members, trans community members. In the Coach Bihar district in northern West Bengal, Shumi Das, a trans activist from an oppressed caste background, told me, quote, "In 2020, I filled the NISD form for 60 to 70 people, but only about 30 to 40 people got it. In 2021, I sent in a list of about 80 to 90 people, but no one, not a single person got it," unquote. Meanwhile, at Nodia district in southern West Bengal, Hena, a Dalit, transgender and kothi-identified activist, told me, quote, "In 2021, I filled in the details for 105 people for the money from NISD, but only about 55 people got it. About 50% of the people, of the applicants did not," unquote. Both activists critiqued the complete lack of transparency regarding the disbursement of the NISD relief. There was no explanation why so many were denied despite applying with the required details. Such gaps in welfare is consistent with the overall parsimony of COVID-19 relief packages. In keeping with the previously mentioned tendency of expanding digital surveillance through welfare, applicants were also required to supply their biometric Aadhaar card number and bank account details. Although NISD released a version of the form in March 2020 for trans persons without Aadhaar card and bank account details, several community activists such as Hena at Nodia told me that they did not receive any information about this alternative version of the form or how to access it. The labor that these activists had to perform in filling out forms, sometimes for hundreds of people, was totally uncompensated. In effect, this amounted to an outsourcing of government work to the unpaid labor of activists who became responsible for the implementation of state welfare and also subsidized related costs, which suggests how strategies of neoliberal responsibilization are folded in or incorporated into welfarist schemes. The intensification of class and caste hierarchies through a combination of developmentalist and neoliberal strategies becomes even clearer in the case of the relief packages provided by the state government in West Bengal. The first round of relief distribution over late April and early May 2020 was mediated through the West Bengal Transgender Development Board, housed under the state government's Department of Women and Child Development and Social Welfare. The West Bengal Trans Development Board was formed through exclusive and restricted consultations with larger metropolitan NGOs in 2015 and subsequently reconstituted in 2020 without any consultations at all. In both cases, mostly metropolitan and or relatively elite dominant caste activists were selected to the board to represent trans communities at the state level. Several community members and activists told me confidentially that they suspected that board members had been chosen on the basis of their prior closeness and contact with the government and ruling party. Activists have also critiqued the manner in which national level bodies, such as the National Council for Transgender Persons, were formed undemocratically during the pandemic. In one media report, Santa Khurai, an activist based in northeastern India, states, quote, "There was no transparency in the manner in which members were selected," unquote. The undemocratic selection of members of trans development boards and councils parallels the non-consultative authorization of experts as people who guide development institutions in pre-neoliberal forms of developmentalism, as has been noted by scholars such as Escobar in South America. Further, similar to the aforementioned linguistic hierarchies between putatively global or national languages like English and Hindi and so-called regional languages, the constitution of developmental mechanisms that incorporate relatively elite trans persons as members reinforces multi-layered hierarchies between so-called national, regional, and local levels of scale. Relatively privileged transgender activists from metropolitan locations often get to stand in for the national, for example, by representing the National Council for Trans Persons, or the regional, the West Bengal Transgender Development Board, and occupy positions of greater proximity to central and state governments. Meanwhile, activists with less fluency in English or Hindi and located in small town or rural areas, who are also often working class and or oppressed caste, are relegated to so-called local levels of activism and lower tiers of institutional power. This hierarchization became particularly clear in April 2020 when two representatives of the West Bengal Transgender Development Board, who were both dominant caste trans activists based in or around the metropolitan city of Kolkata, sent an email to community-based organizations, or CBOs, across West Bengal, which urged, quote, all CBOs and NGOs who are working on TG welfare in the state to partner in the COVID response and come forward as nodal organizations in your area who will lead this distribution of relief, unquote. CBO activists from districts were asked to volunteer to draw up lists of names of needy community members and to take rations to them physically, often at personal risk, since the state did not provide them with any protective equipment. Thus, CBOs and activists working in non-metropolitan and rural areas were called in for channelizing COVID-related relief at the local district level, but were neither consulted for the state level process of board formation, nor during the design of COVID-related relief measures. This combines the process of neoliberal responsibilization through the outsourcing of state functions to unpaid activists, with hierarchies of scale reinforced through top-down developmentalist mechanisms in India and beyond. Whether consciously or not, the relatively elite trans activists who were selected for the West Bengal trans boards thus served to bolster and suture neoliberal and developmentalist boards of governance, and indeed to suture them together. Another potential source of surveillance and exclusion, but also activist challenge to such processes is evident in the central and state governments. Sorry, I should have gone over this slide earlier. Anyway, so another potential source of surveillance and exclusion, but also activist challenge to such processes is evidenced in the central and state government's usage of the transgender category to demarcate and qualify gender non-conforming persons for COVID relief. As mentioned earlier, the trans-feminine spectrum of kothi-hijra communities in Eastern India encompasses a variety of gendered subject positions, including feminine males, trans women, people identifying as a third or separate gender, and various fluid combinations of these subject positions. While South Asian communities have adopted and hybridized the transgender category for purposes such as gaining transnational funds and building solidarity networks, the state's definition of transgender also tends to presume a binary between cisgender and transgender categories, which tends to separate kothis as feminine males who have sex with males from hijras who are seen as transgender. And thus, this elides overlapping subject positions within the community spectrum that I just described. The Indian state has also policed inclusion in the transgender category through psychosocial and even anatomical criteria, despite protests by trans activists. In this context, there was much ambiguity and confusion in activist circles regarding whether legal proof of trans identity would be needed to access COVID relief, particularly in the case of the NISD grant provided by the central government. The Google form for direct cash transfer released by NISD in March 2020 asked for the Aadhaar card numbers of applicants. As both Shumi and Hina noted, many community members in their respective districts have obtained their Aadhaar cards under the male rather than transgender category. The form also asked if the applicant was associated with any trans community-based organization or CBO. While filling in the form for applicants who did not have their Aadhaar card as transgender, Shumi and Hina indicated that the applicant was associated with their respective trans CBOs. This trick seemed to work, as some applicants who did receive the relief money despite their legal identification as male, their CBO affiliation seemed to qualify them as transgender for purposes of receiving state aid. In the case of the distribution of the state government's relief packages, district-based activists were the people who were actually disbursing the relief on the ground and were also selecting participants for such relief. And they often used this position of responsibilization to exert their agency in choosing a wider range of recipients than those the state might recognize as transgender. Several activists, including Shumi in Coach Bihar, Oruna in Murshidabad, and Silk in Noida, told me that they extended relief to community members who might not qualify as trans by state criteria. For example, kothis who mostly wear male attire, who are heterosexually married, and or have features perceived as masculine, such as beards, but who are recognized as sisters within the community. This shows how activists are not merely passive responsibilized agents, but might use their enhanced role within responsibilization to frustrate the state surveillance and regulation of trans identity through trans-related developmental mechanisms. Responsibilized agents thus exceed or subvert their stipulated roles to disrupt both neoliberal and developmentalist modes of governance. Now, coming to non-state trans initiatives for relief, outside of the activities that the trans activists conducted under the aegis of the state, there was also much trans-kothi-hijra mobilization conducted separately from the state, encompassing relief distribution, fundraising, and advocacy, given the inadequacy and sporadic nature of state aid. Some of this work directly challenged the framework of neoliberal responsibilization by appealing to the developmentalist and welfarist promises of the state, such as the petition signed by more than 2,000 trans activists across India that I mentioned earlier. However, since such appeals seemed to go unheeded, in many cases, activists had no option but to step in and fulfill responsibilities towards affected communities that the state did not fulfill. However, rather than a unilateral case of responsibilization, this activism both reinforced and sometimes ruptured or challenged neoliberal developmentalist frameworks. In the districts of Coach Bihar and Nodia, the CBOs Mutrishangjak Coach Bihar and Nodia Sampriti Society provided support on a more continuous basis and reached many more community people than those covered by central and state government schemes, relying on money raised through online fundraisers. Shumi, for example, told me, Shumi in Coach Bihar told me that during the second wave of COVID in 2021, neither central nor state government relief reached the community at Coach Bihar, whereas her CBO provided relief to about 1,200 people. Similarly, the activist Silk at Nodia described how her CBO, Nodia Ranaghat Sampriti Society, ran a 6-month-long community kitchen in 2020, regularly serving about 25 of the most vulnerable Hijra and Kothi community members who had lost their livelihood of blessing people for money in public transport. This CBO provided relief 3 times to about 200 people in 2020 and expanded its operations to cover around 1,000 in 2021, reaching them much more frequently than the state. As Shumi noted, such fundraising initiatives allowed them to network and build contacts with people and funders, both inside and outside the country. So this mobilization of support networks allowed both Shumi and Silk to explicitly critique metropolitan dominant caste activists who dominate the developmental mechanisms of the state, like the Transgender Board, in public posts on social media. Further, Silk noted that the mobilization of non-state support also permitted her to refuse patronizing offers of state relief from local political representatives, which were meant only to gain political credit before the 2021 assembly elections in West Bengal. Sharma observes that the state developmental programs in India often reinforce gendered hierarchies through paternalistic welfare directed at women. In this case, Silk used her responsibilized position to resist paternalistic offers of welfare made towards the feminized trans-kothi-hijra community, while remaining critical of the state's abdication of its responsibilities. Silk also noted that her CBO's success in raising funds and providing relief granted leverage in negotiating welfare from the state. Quote, "We gained respect from the local administration. The name of the organization was highlighted," unquote. Utilizing this recognition, Silk successfully lobbied the district administration to provide COVID vaccines to over 100 community members, in 2021. These negotiations demonstrate how neoliberal and developmentalist modes of governance may be played against each other as activists build on their role as responsibilized agents to both contest paternalistic forms of welfare and to lobby the state into performing its developmentalist role, countering the neoliberal retrenchment of such functions and the resultant neglect of their communities. While, as noted earlier, elite activists may serve to suture neoliberal and developmentalist tendencies, such negotiations with the state capitalize on the frictions between neoliberal and developmentalist logics of state power. So I'll actually skip this slide for the sake of time, but basically I can talk more in the Q&A if required regarding how there are also dangers associated with such neoliberalized activism and this position of neoliberalized responsibilization, or like responsibilized, agents that activists are compelled to fulfill. So for example, competition for funds, unequal access to funds based on class caste status and metropolitan location, and so on. So in conclusion, this talk has sought to situate the Indian state's management of COVID-19 pandemic in terms of an evolving assemblage of neoliberal and developmentalist policies and strategies, and to analyze the role of trans activism within this assemblage. While trans negotiations with state power and governance are diverse and sometimes contradictory, I have contended that they demonstrate the potential of utilizing tensions and gaps in the neoliberal developmentalist assemblage of COVID governance to both push the state towards fulfilling its developmentalist promises on one hand, and to push back against statist surveillance, top-down mechanisms of development, and paternalistic relationships of welfare on the other hand. These potentials are endangered and structurally circumscribed by the aforementioned tendencies of individualist fragmentation and competition, significantly described despite the success of several CBOs in raising independent funds and negotiating for state welfare. There is a conspicuous absence of collective networks led by non-metropolitan working class activists that could build on these gains and sustain them beyond the pandemic. Trans activism in India is thus positioned between a present fraught with multifarious possibilities and an uncertain and precarious future. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Dutta, for a really brilliant and insightful talk. We will now move into our Q&A. So if you have any questions for Dr. Dutta, please submit them through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you should be able to find at the bottom bar of your Zoom window if you are accessing Zoom on a computer. So while we wait for questions, I suppose I will start by asking just a little bit about the relationship between domestic and international NGOs in this kind of hierarchicalization of trans and gender minority identities that you were talking about. Obviously, you're pointing to places where this hierarchy is occurring within the Indian context, but also we know that a lot of the remaking of various identities as being trans identities comes from a kind of globalized push for kind of conformity in how we talk about gender variant people. So what is the relationship between the domestic and international NGOs in this?
Sure. So do you want me to take this question individually first, or wait for some questions and collect them and then respond?
Go ahead and answer that one, and then we'll answer more questions that come in.
Great, thank you. So yeah, that's a very important issue, I think. Interestingly enough, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was less, or at least in the areas that I was working in, the regions I was working in, there was less direct coordination with, trans nonprofits, funders, etc., based in the West and working solely in the West or mainly in the West. And a lot of it was more in relation with diasporic, South Asian-led collectives in the US and Western Europe. For example, in the US, Parivar South Asia, which is a nonprofit based out of the Bay Area, but led by diasporic South Asians. Parivar was instrumental in providing funding and support to a lot of the community organizations that I interacted with, actually. And so in some ways, it was less like a clear hierarchization between international or like, or Western NGOs, and more in some ways a continuation of the hierarchies that were already evident within the Indian context, because a lot of these, South Asian diasporic activists who are based in the West, they are also, they traveled to India later in the later parts of the pandemic when international travel became more possible, and so in some ways they were almost like an extension of the, the metropolitan activist scene in India, rather than being like very clearly separate from, from the domestic sector. So I would also here note that actually directly working with international or like purely Western NGOs, which do not have pre-existing contact with Indian organizations, is also complicated because by some government restrictions, because the government has during the pandemic period actually tightened its regulations on the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, or FCRA, which limits the ways in which nonprofits can receive funding. So only certain NGOs, can receive funding which have FCRA clearance, which requires their budgets to be above a certain limit, and also which requires them to go through a very intensive like audit process. So this means that organizations who are directly receiving funding from Western funders were, for example, the Global Fund, which is not like technically entirely Western. It's like the Global Fund to combat malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS, or something of that lines. It's based in Geneva, and it's a transnational sort of alliance or consortium. And so these were NGOs who were based in metropolitan cities and who were already working with these funders, and work like CBOs or community organizations led by more working class spectrum community members. They were often actually mediating or getting relief mediated by these metropolitan organizations, rather than directly interacting with funders based in the West. And that actually continues the patterns we've seen earlier in India during the AIDS pandemic, for example, or of course, that's not something that's really ended, but during the height of the HIV/AIDS funding regime, or the HIV/AIDS industry, as it's been called, again, like there was this multi-tiered sort of, mediated access, and not sort of direct, unmediated access between so-called local community organizations and Western or transnational funders. So in some ways, like the scalar hierarchies are already evident in the Indian level, and or in the Indian domestic context, and the way that transnational funders enter is very mediated by the kind of metropolitan activist community that I mentioned in my, or discussed in my talk.
Okay, just invitation, go ahead and submit any other questions that you may have among attendees. As a follow-up, I wanted to ask about, obviously in analyzing COVID, there's a lot of kind of crisis point strain that's put on state systems and on communities. And I'm wondering how much of the kind of dynamics that you're analyzing here are kind of unique to the COVID context versus more general of the kind of broad ways that hierarchies of identity, both, as trans, but also as Dalit, like how much of this is kind of a magnification of things that are always happening versus a particular failure at this specific point.
Yeah, again, that's like, it's a great question and a complex issue. I think, well, a lot of it is not new, obviously, like the state, like this, during COVID-19, it just rebranded and repackaged a lot of the mechanisms that were already in place. And, a lot of these tendencies have been already also evidenced during a previous period, during the height of the HIV industry, as I mentioned. The intensity of the pandemic might mark some long-term structural changes in terms of how the state, relates to minorities and structurally marginalized groups. And but that's also actually very contested. For example, the state did try to institute a very radical departure in terms of deregulating the farm sector. So this is not directly connected to the communities I work with, because most of them are not actually working as farmers, although of course, trans people can also be work in the agricultural sector. So farmers had to contest 3 pro-corporate farm laws, which were meant to which basically utilize this whole pandemic-induced crisis to push through far-reaching reforms and to open up the farming sector to transnational capital even more than it had been already opened up, and to dismantle whatever minimum price support systems remained. But this did not actually work out because there was a prolonged farmers movement, and people were farmers were able to actually get the state to withdraw this attempt to enact these laws. So it's it seems like, I think that even if there are radical changes, these will not go uncontested. And again, a lot of the trans-related developmental mechanisms and measures are also a continuation of mechanisms that had already been there. The development boards, National Transgender Council is actually legislated as by the Transgender Act, which was brought in 2019. So actually also, because it's also part of the whole phenomenon that you see, that a lot of governments actually did not want to, they reacted in this sort of very contradictory way to the pandemic. So on one hand, when they reacted, they often imposed extremely harsh measures. This is especially true in the global south, and huge restrictions on mobility. But on the other hand, they also it's very clear from a lot of government statements and responses that they just wished the pandemic to sort of disappear and go away. That they did not really they were not wanting to make any sort of deep structural changes at all. So this contradiction also plays in. So the government itself also did not really take the pandemic very seriously beyond a point. It did not really make any fundamental changes in terms of healthcare funding or financing. The lockdown beyond a point proved unsustainable. So while it was brought back into 2021 during the second wave, it was not as harsh. It wouldn't have been possible to enforce that kind of a harsh lockdown anymore. There would have been mass rebellion, really. So the lockdowns also became much more sporadic, and the beyond a point, the government just basically raised its hands and washed off its sorry, mixed metaphors, but basically washed its hands off from the whole pandemic situation. That's very much what we saw during the third wave, the Omicron fuel so-called third wave that happened in January, when it was almost everything was just running as usual, and people just basically had to deal with it on their own for the most part. So again, I think this pandemic remains to be seen how far of a structural change it really, or a structural departure from some pre-existing tendencies, it really propels in countries like India. But so far, I think it's more a reconfiguration of existing tendencies and less a sort of radical departure from anything at all. Yeah.
Right. So due to time, we'll only get to one more of the questions that were submitted, but I wanted to follow up with this question because it's quite related to what you were just talking about with the development boards. So in the context of COVID, how much of their work and the money that they were channeling through for trans people, how much was that conceptualized as a kind of temporary relief versus development that's building for revival or parallel channels of income or kind of more long-term kind of development goals?
Right. Yeah, that's again a great question. And thanks for those who are staying on beyond, because I guess it's already 2 p.m. So I'll try to be brief. Yeah, so I think, again, there were both, but most of the directly COVID related measures were conceptualized as relief, or they were promoted as or branded as being relief, but there were all other measures which had been announced before the pandemic. For example, there's this shelter homes called Garima Greh for trans people that were basically these are grants which were awarded to several trans community organizations in different metropolitan cities for running shelter homes for trans people. And these were actually initially promised before the pandemic, but the first set of them, the first set of these Garima Grehs or shelter homes were actually implemented during the pandemic, just in terms of the timing and how that worked out once the first intensive lockdown was over. And that is meant as a more long-term measure, although it's also extremely neoliberal in some ways, because so it's basically meant to to facilitate the integration of especially trans women actually, into the workforce, and to, although there are also trans masculine people in these shelter homes. So it's especially meant to kind of wean away trans women from hijra professions, which are seen as being unproductive and sometimes even criminalized as, begging and disruption to public order. So they're supposed to, like, a lot of the inhabitants of Garima Grace are supposed to work from the shelter home, and it's meant to like facilitate their integration into the sort of corporate mainstream, basically. So that is conceptualized as long-term development, and that is, I think, a very clear scenario where developmentalist mechanisms are also geared towards neoliberal imperatives or motivations.
Wonderful. So thank you so much. That brings us to the end of today's event. Thank you to Dr. Dutta, and thank you to all of you so much for being here. As I mentioned at the start of our event, the center will be taking a break in our events programming for the summer holiday, and we will return with our next event in August. For details on that event when we announce it, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram @transstudies, and subscribe to our email list on our website at appliedtransstudies.org, and you'll get the notification for that event. So thank you all again, and see you in August. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and for the questions I could not address, please feel free to email me. I would be very happy to take up these conversations further. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.